lot of science papers out there. And reading science papers is a really crucial skill, but so is being able to choose what to read and how to prioritize your reading time. The more into a research project you get, the more important this is going to be. And not all papers need to have a deep dive. There's this common misconception that you kind of either deep read a paper or you don't read it at all. And this makes don't read it at all seem like a much easier option because there's no way you could deep read all the science papers out there. But the truth is that you should be spending different amounts of time on different papers depending on what your purpose going in is. If you're just looking for a method, just go straight there. But if it's a paper that's directly relevant to your project, you might be doing a deep read, going into the supplemental, and then revisiting this paper over and over the years, each time getting more information out of it. As you have more background, as you have more of your own findings, you can see how they relate. So being able to prioritize your reading time and approaching papers with a purpose is really important. And so I want to tell you more about how I strategize things.
The first step is to just know what's out there. We talk about staying up to date with the literature and how it's important that you stay up to date with the literature. And it is in the sense of knowing what's out there, knowing what other groups are working on, knowing what the state of the field is. But that doesn't mean staying up to date with the literature doesn't mean that you're deep reading all of the papers that come out. That would be impossible. But you should know what's coming out and have a broader idea. If there's a paper that comes out that's relevant to your research, then you should be able to know about it and be able to then pursue it with your particular goals in mind. And you can also just find really cool random papers because, well, it's important to keep a broader perspective of the world, and you never know where you get inspiration. But I'm going to focus mostly on when you're reading a paper that's kind of going to be directly relevant to you. So there are some papers that are going to be relevant to your field, but not your project in particular, or at least you don't think so until you go and browse their paper. There are going to be other papers where they're going to be directly relevant to your work. These are the ones that you're going to spend a lot of time reading. And then there are going to be ones that basically you just are trying to find a method for your own experiments, or maybe you want to see what concentration people used or what the results were of one specific experiment that you're trying to replicate, something just like a concentration, like an enzyme assay or something, where you're not focused on their interpretation of the results, but really just what the results were that they got. And so basically, you're going to be able to have these ideas about what you want to get out of the paper. And often the way that you get these ideas is if you're not just like directly going to a paper by because you Google search for a method or something, then you're going to have to come across this paper some way. And a common way is by setting up alerts and RSS feeds so that you know what's out there. And so you can set up alerts with like Google Scholar or PubMed or Pub Crawler or things like that. I really like RSS feeds in an RSS reader. So I use this RSS reader NewsBlur. I just use the free version. There are others out there too. Basically, with an RSS feed, you can set it up for different websites, or you can set it up for various search terms. You can set up custom RSS feeds in like PubMed, as well as RSS feeds from various journal websites. And so I have a whole post on that as well. But basically then if you have an RSS like reader, it'll kind of collate these all together, and it'll show you the different articles that fit within the RSS feed. I really like how NewsBlur kind of like shows you the title and then the abstract. I know they say that you shouldn't judge a book by a cover and you shouldn't judge a paper by its title or by its abstract, but often this is all that you're going to see from a paper because you just don't have time to go and look at all these papers. But what you should keep an eye out for is something that sounds like it could be directly relevant to your work or to your field. Keep an eye out for papers by key labs in the field. You can set up alerts for that as well, so that if one of the key players in the field like publishes a paper, you'll get an alert for that. But so you can see the title and you can see the abstract, and you can see whether it might contain information that would be relevant to you. And if so, you want to go and check out the paper. And when I talk about checking out the paper, that doesn't mean that you have to go and start from the very beginning and read in detail the whole paper. Instead, what I like to do is I start by like skimming it. I scroll through and I look at all the figures. Looking at the figures, I mean, just like a broad overview, and then if I want, I can dig in deeper. But when you're looking at the figures, you can tell a lot of information. You can tell what type of experiments did they do? What type of data are they working with? Are they working with really in vitro stuff, like things in a test tube? Or are they working in mice or people? Are they just I know it's a ton of work, evaluating published data, like is it some sort of meta-analysis, they're comparing different studies, or is it some sort of they're doing like low throughput research, high throughput research, various things like this. I also like to look at the methods section. That's another way you can tell what sort of things that they do, and we'll talk more about methods when you're actually just going to a paper for the methods section. But when you look at the figures, you should be able to tell what type of experiments did they do, as well as kind of, you should be able to interpret those figures without getting bogged down in all the text. So typically there's like a long results section where they're interpreting the figures for you. But if you can interpret the figures yourself, then you don't need to rely on all that text, which that text is important, especially if you're trying to see what claims they're trying to make from it. But typically what I do, if it's just a paper that is somewhat relevant to me, is I'll look at those figures and I'll look at their abstracted conclusions to see what they're trying to say about those figures, and then see whether I feel that their figures actually support that. And so if I really cared about those results and I wanted to make sure that I had a thorough understanding, I would read those results section. I would read the whole thing. I would dig into the supplementals, and I do this when I'm reading a paper that's directly relevant to me or for a section that's directly relevant to me. But I won't go and do that for the whole paper for most of the papers that I'm going to read. This quick figure scroll can kind of help you prioritize, then determine your purpose for reading that paper, determine your goal with goal for with that reading that paper. So this is for a paper that's kind of like not directly relevant to your research, but it's relevant to your field and things like this. It's also important to note that doing the scrolling, you might find something that is directly relevant to you. And if so, you want to give that more attention. And so you want to basically find those sections where maybe there's a hint of something where they're not even researching the molecule where you're working on, but they're using it as a tool, or there's some sort of connection to your work. And then you want to read that part more carefully. Maybe jump to the methods for that section, for that experiment where they're working with that thing that might be relevant to you. And I know that I'm kind of like making it sound like you have a super self-centric version of like viewpoint for reading a paper, but you kind of have to do that once you get deep into your research, and you just don't have time to do that deep, thorough reading. When you're just starting out with your research, you're going to be doing a lot more of that deep reading. And I have more posts on that and videos on that about how you can really in-depth read papers and take notes when you're doing so. But there's just not enough time for it when you're spending the majority of your time in the lab doing research. You need to really focus and prioritize your reading time so that you're making the most of all those papers that are out there. So that was when you're trying to just like familiarize yourself with something that's kind of related to your project, and it might be more related than you thought, but you wouldn't know unless you went and you skimmed through that paper. You can also search for within that paper for key terms, maybe the molecule that you're working on, to see whether they're referencing it and how. There are other papers where basically you want to get all the insight that you can out of that paper. And so this might be a paper that directly kicks off your research. So in my PhD, my project was based on a couple of papers that had come out. And so I read those papers probably hundreds of times, and I went back to them over and over, because each time you go back to it, then you pick up more information, both because you have a better understanding about things. Like I remember the first time I read those papers, I was really confused, and there were parts I really didn't understand. But then over the years, as I developed a deeper understanding, both of the background I needed, as well as my own findings that kind of added more to the paper, and also that made me interpret some things about the paper in a new light, I couldn't do that reinterpretation unless I reread the paper. And so don't feel guilty that you're going back and rereading the same paper, that you're spending hours and hours reading that paper, because you really do pick up more information out of it. I spend hours reading the same paper over and over. And sometimes I'm like, well, I have this whole list of papers that I might read. And then I end up just reading this one, and I've already read this paper. But that's okay, because it's helping me design my own experiments. It's helping me think critically about my experiments, and it's helping me kind of evaluate my experiments. And so this can be a really, really fundamental thing. But of course, you can't spend hours and hours on all the papers. And often when you're doing research, the only thing you care about from a paper is going to be a concentration or a method or something like this. And this is often how you're going to come across a paper, is not with one of those RSS feeds, not with one of those alerts, but really just with your good old Google, and searching for a method. Or maybe you find a method cited in one paper and then you go and check it out. When you're doing this, you don't need to read the whole papers. You might not even care about what they found from using that method. You just want to know what the method was and how they used it. And so I have a whole post on like reading methods and trying to recreate methods and things like this. But bottom line is you're going to typically jump straight to that materials and methods section. A lot of times these days, this is going to be tucked into the supplemental section. Speaking of that supplemental, when you're doing a deep read, a lot of times you can find a lot of quality stuff in that supplemental, as well as potentially in bioRxiv. If there's like preprint versions of the paper, it might have more information. Things that they took out from the main paper because they didn't have enough space or something like that. But we're not talking about that here. We're talking about the supplemental from your main paper. And so, yeah, basically a lot of the materials and methods go in there. So it can be good to kind of just like browse different browse papers and see what type of method people are using to answer the sort of question that you want. And then when you find a paper that is more relevant, then you can kind of deep dive more into it. But you're going to be looking a lot of the time for various concentrations that people use when they were doing some sort of drug treatment, or how many hours did they induce their bacterial growth for, or things like this. So you can find this information in the materials and methods without having to read the whole paper. So that's a really, really focused read. Sometimes you just really just want a broader overall picture, and you don't really, you don't want to even just like waste too much energy trying to evaluate the claims. You kind of just want to see what's going on out in the world. So if you just want to read a paper for enjoyment, just do whatever the heck you want. Sometimes if the paper is like way outside of your field, what you can do is you can look for those like news and views, or kind of like summaries of the papers that are actually written, like published in journals and things. So they're not just like that. They're not just like general audience things, but more scientific focused audience, but not necessarily people that have the background on that project or on that field. And so you can get a kind of broader overview, but still has some of the details. And so that can be a good way to kind of get an overview of what's going on. And yeah, but do try to not just be focused on the papers that are directly relevant to your project, but do also realize that you can't spend hours and hours reading something that's not going to that's not actually contributing to your work. For the most part, you're going to be finding papers based on these alerts, based on Google, based on this sort of thing. And when you do, you need to then skim through those papers, see what they're, figure out what your purpose is for reading the paper. What's your goal? Are you hoping to do a deep dive? Are you hoping to just get what you need and leave? And then spend the amount of time that dictates. And so hope this helped you. Hope that this is going to help make reading papers seem more approachable. So reading papers is really important. And I'm not trying to discourage you from reading papers at all. I'm just trying to say, spend the most make the most use of your paper reading time, so that you don't get bogged down on the papers that aren't important, that you can then prioritize the papers that are more important to you and the parts of papers that are more important to you, so that you can use the information from those papers to work towards your own papers and work towards your own experiments and findings, because I don't know about you, but I think that doing the experiments is really, really fun. And it's really important when you're designing experiments, when you're doing experiments, that you have a sense of how people do experiments and what people have found before you. And this can make your experiments a lot more meaningful and a lot more informative and exciting.